What is going on, chess YouTube? So in today's video, I want to show you an incredible game played between Gukesh D, the new chess world champion, and Magnus Carlsen, the greatest chess player of all time. And this game did take place in the 2024 Warsaw Superbet Blitz Tournament. And here we go. In the game, Gukesh is playing as white. He opens 1e4, and Magnus, very interestingly, he does go 1c6, the Caro-Kann Defense, a relatively rare guest at the highest level. Now we have d4, d5, and e5 heading for the advanced variation. This is the sharpest and most theoretical variation against the Caro-Kann. If you want to fight for an advantage as white, this is the way to go, but it is very, very sharp and very complicated. Now Magnus, he goes for the main line in response. That is bishop f5, opting not to go c5 right away, challenging that pawn on d4. c5 is also playable, but overall bishop f5 is probably the main line and the more solid choice by black. Of course, black's plan is to go e6, then develop his pieces, perhaps castle on the king side or queen side, and have a very good typical Caro-Kann game. Now here, Gukesh, he again follows the main line, knight f3, then e6, then bishop e2. This is the short variation, named, I believe, after Nigel Short. If I am wrong, correct me in the comment section below, but I believe Nigel Short was the one who popularized this line. The main idea is to go short castles, then either knight d2 or c3, and continue developing, having a good game. Now here in the game, Magnus, he goes knight e7, developing the knight, potentially threatening c5 on the next move. For that reason, a lot of players nowadays, they always go c3 in response to an early knight e7, stopping c5, as then white can take the pawn and go b4, clamping onto it if he ever does go c5. Now instead here, Gukesh, he does go short castle, allowing black to go c5 if he wants it. That would be a very combative idea, but instead here, Magnus, he does just go h6, giving his bishop some loft on the king side if it needs it. Now it can go to the h7 square in the future, and beyond that, he is also setting up the idea of g5, gaining space on the king side. That would be a very aggressive attacking plan, and we do see it quite a bit in this line of the Caro-Kann. Now here, Gukesh, he does go c3, stopping the c5 advance. Again, if c5, that would be dubious as white can take the pawn, then go b4, hanging on to the extra pawn before black can win it back. Now here, Magnus, in this position, the main line for black is simply knight d7, perhaps intending ideas like queen c7 and g5, gaining space on the king side. Now, instead of that here, he does go a5, and this line for black, basically going a5 in the short variation of the advanced variation of the Caro-Kann, has become increasingly popular lately. I believe Pavel Eljanov, the Ukrainian grandmaster, recently did a course for this on Modern Chess. It's a very creative idea. Black actually is threatening to go a4, the Alpha Zero inspired idea, gaining space on the queen side and overall trying to clamp down on white's attempts to gain space on that side of the board. Now here, Gukesh is on his A game. He goes a4 himself, locking down those pawns on the queen side. The Alpha Zero pawns are kissing each other. How cute on the queen side. All right, now Magnus, here, as usual in this line of the Caro-Kann, he has a million different moves. Just to go through the gamut, knight d7 is likely the main line, but beyond that, you can go bishop g6, bishop h7, queen b6, g5, and so on. Now in the game, knight d7 is the move, and now Gukesh, he has a very important decision. How do you want to continue developing your pieces? Well, the main problem you have is this knight on the b1 square. Where does it want to go? It turns out a3 and d2 are decent squares for the knight. Beyond that, you could also go for the immediate knight to e1, intending perhaps bishop d3 and then knight d2 and knight to f3. That is a very common regrouping plan for the knights in this variation. Now in the game, Gukesh, he plays the older move. That is just knight d2. This is the old way of playing this variation. White often foregoed the c3 move, went knight d2, knight b3, bishop t2, rook c1, and so on. That is the older way of playing this line. Now here, Magnus, in this position, again, he's got a million options. Bishop g6 and h7, as well as queen c7 and b6 are the main options here for black. Now in the game, he does go queen b6. This is a slight surprise. I mean, yes, you are putting pressure on that pawn on b2. However, b6 is typically not the best square for the queen in this variation of the Caro-Kann. Typically, it does want to go to c7. That is generally thought to be a more flexible square for the queen. Now here, Gukesh, how does he want to continue? The computer loves the idea of rook e1, then knight f1, then knight g3, the standard Roy Lopez and Italian game maneuver for the knight. Now instead, he goes knight b3, swinging it over to the queen side. This is, again, in the spirit of the older way of playing this line. The idea being you go knight b3, bishop d2, rook c1, and then maybe c4, trying to open up the queen side. Now here, Magnus, he continues, bishop h7, retreating his bishop, and now here, Gukesh, bishop d2, again, continuing his plan. Now, Magnus, how does he want to continue developing? The main problem here is the knight on e7 and the bishop on f8. That knight, of course, traps the bishop on f8, and Magnus does have to develop his king side, as the king may not be safe on the queen side. Long castles is technically playable, but that could be a very risky move, given that black's pawn is already on a5. It would be very easy for white to open up lines on the queen side with, say, c4 or even a future b4 advance. Now here, Magnus, he does go knight g6. Now, this move looks a little bit strange. I mean, typically you would want to go knight to f5 instead of g6. That way you leave open the idea of going g5, gaining space on the king side. Now, with knight g6, the knight does block in the bishop on h7. That is a very strange placement for these pieces here. But of course, Magnus must have his ideas. He is the greatest chess player of all time, of course. Now here, h4 for white, the alpha zero move, potentially threatening h5, knocking back that knight. This is a very common idea whenever black, or white for that matter, has a knight on the g6 or the g3 square. When that happens, this idea of h4, then h5 becomes very strong potentially. Now here, Magnus, bishop e7, putting pressure on that pawn. Now you must defend it or push it forward. The two options are h5 or g3, defending h4, and Gukesh, being the very aggressive attacking player, he does go h5, pushing the alpha zero pawn down the board and driving back that knight. Now here, Magnus, the move for him, believe it or not, it's not knight to f8. That would be an incredibly passive square for the knight. I mean, it would be virtually entombed on there forever unless black went, say, g6, something like that, but that could be risky as well. Instead, he jumps forward with the knight to h4, putting pressure on that knight on f3, and if it ever needs it, it can go to f5 in the future, so believe it or not, this is a very safe square for the knight in this position. Now here, Gukesh, the strongest way to continue, according to the computer, according to Stockfish, is trading on h4, knight takes h4, then after bishop takes, you go c4, trying to open up lines on the queen side. Instead of that, he actually retreats his own knight and leaves the black knight on the h4 square. So, knight to e1 is the move, intending perhaps bishop d3. Again, that is a relatively common idea in this line of the Caro-Kann. But now, Magnus, he's going to have a wide variety of options for how to continue. Of course, trading knights is not a possibility, and just going back, knight f5 would be a little bit passive. White could go g4 any point in the future, so with that in mind here, black's best options are to go either g6, f6, or g5, trying to get some sort of play going on the king side before you castle your king. With your king still on e8, you can open up the king side, as the king can always stay in the center or castle queen side in the future if it needs to. Now, here, Magnus, instead of these moves, g6, g5, or f6, he actually castles short. Short castles the move, and according to the engine, this move is a little bit dubious. I mean, now you give up the option of trying to open up the king side. I mean, you can still do it, but now your king, with the king committed to the king side, that could be a lot riskier. Now here, what are white's options? He has many different ideas. For example, g3, driving back the knight, bishop f4, developing, but instead in the game, knight to d3 was played. And this move is a little bit strange. I mean, typically when you do this knight to e1 maneuver in this line, the idea is to go bishop d3, f4, and so on. Knight d3 is a little bit unusual, and here it isn't that strong. All right, Magnus, c5, breaking on the queen side, a little bit dubious, and kind of justifying this move knight d3. Instead, f6 was the better way forward, trying to open up the f-file for your rook. Now here, Gukesh, it trades on c5 many times. Knight takes c5, knight takes, d takes c5, bishop takes, and now we have knight takes and queen takes. All right, after all these trades, both sides have given up a pawn and two pairs of minor pieces. Now white has the bishop pair versus the bishop and the knight of black. And these two bishops, I mean, these could be a very powerful asset depending on how the game progresses. All right, now, in this position, one of the more obvious moves is just bishop e3, putting pressure on the queen. But instead of that here, Gukesh does go bishop f4, defending that pawn on e5 in advance. Now, this move is a little bit weaker than bishop e3, but Gukesh is still doing perfectly fine. All right, Magnus, bishop e4, flying in with the bishop. Of course, now the threat is potentially bishop takes g2. White will have to defend against that threat. What is he going to do in this position? Well, you can advance the pawn one square g3, driving back that knight. But instead here, Gukesh, he actually goes g4, advancing it 2 squares. Very weird move. All right, f5 from Magnus, opening up the king side. Finally, he's getting a typical Caro-Kann counterplay on the king side with this move, threatening f takes g4, putting pressure on the bishop on f4. White's going to have to respond. What's it going to be? Well, here, the two best moves for white are g5 and bishop g3. One of these moves is necessary. I mean, Magnus here is already starting to take over in this game. If he doesn't find one of those moves, g5 or bishop g3, he will be in a lot of trouble. And here it turns out he misses those moves. He goes bishop e3, putting pressure on the queen on c5, but this move is a very critical mistake here, Magnus. He just goes d4, advancing in the center, a deflection sacrifice. The point being, he's freeing up that d5 square for the queen. If the queen goes to d5, he's going to have tremendous pressure on this diagonal. For example, a threat could be bishop h1, then queen g2, checkmate, and so on. All right, now, Gukesh, what's it going to be? It turns out you do need to trade with the bishop. Bishop takes d4 is the right way forward, but instead, c takes d4 was played in the game. And this move is a little bit clumsy. With bishop takes d4, at least you're opening up more lines for your queen to get over to the king side, perhaps queen d2, queen e3, and so on. But now with c takes d4, this bishop, it almost gets in the way, and white's going to have a very hard time defending these very weak light squares on the king side. All right, now, Magnus, queen d5, the obvious move, centralizing the queen. Now the threat, of course, perhaps bishop h1, then queen g2, and so on. What is Gukesh going to do about it? Well, the right move here is just f4, gaining space on the king side, trying to give your queen, again, more access to these critical squares, but instead he plays the move rook c1, and this move is a critical mistake. Yes, it's a blitz game, but however, this move, if Magnus finds the right continuation, it does lose literally on the spot. I am not exaggerating. And if you like puzzles, go ahead and pause the video right now and try to find the beautiful tactical shot from Magnus Carlsen. And while you're at it, if you want to see more videos just like this, where I hold my breath for 20 minutes straight, go and smash that YouTube like button. Thank you so much for doing that. All right, here, Magnus, the key move. This is a shocker. It is the move bishop c2, the deflection move, hitting the queen on d1. And if you take the bishop with any piece, the queen or the rook, then queen g2 is checkmate. Wow, that would have been a killer sacrifice. Unfortunately, Magnus did not find it in the game. Instead, knight to f3 was the move. Now, what is the threat of this move? Well, first of all, you are putting the king in check. White has to deal with that somehow, some way. In the game, Gukesh, he does just trade on f3. Bishop takes f3, then bishop takes, and then queen d3. Of course, the queen was under the attack by the bishop. The queen had to go somewhere, so queen d3, not a bad idea at all. But now Magnus, once again, he has another beautiful shot. Again, if you like puzzles, pause the video and try to find the next key idea for Magnus right here. This one is very, very creative. All right, the idea, you want to go bishop g2. The point being, you are putting pressure on the rook, and if the rook moves, say rook e1, then the move, believe it or not, is bishop to h3, threatening queen g2. And again, if the rook moves, then something like f3 doesn't work, as black just takes the pawn. The rook is no longer on f1. But if you leave the rook on f1, then you just take the rook, and obviously you win the exchange, that being the rook for the minor piece. That would be just excellent for black. So overall, bishop g2, a tremendous move, was not found in the game. Instead here, f takes g4 was played, and now here, Gukesh, what's it going to be? Well, the strongest move for white here is just queen to g6, bringing the queen over to the king side. But instead here, Gukesh plays the move rook c5, and this is a fatal mistake here, Magnus. Once again, he has a beautiful way to almost decide the game on the spot. Again, if you like puzzles, pause the video and try to find this attacking idea for Magnus. All right, the key idea here is queen to d8, retreating the queen, potentially threatening queen to h4, then queen h1, checkmate. And it turns out that threat is just incredibly difficult to stop. Black has such a dominance on these light squares on the king side. Now, instead of that, in the game, queen e4 was played, offering the queen trade. And now, Gukesh, he does go for it. So, queen takes, bishop takes, and then rook f to c1. Now, here in this position, the material is even. Both sides have, let's count on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pawns, the bishop and the 2 rooks. However, the big imbalance here, we have the bishops of opposite colors. Now, if it was just the bishops, this would be a notoriously drawish endgame. However, with those 2 rooks on the board, it is all about the attack. And here, black's bishop is just so much better placed, so much more active than the white counterpart. The white counterpart is practically a giant pawn at this point, whereas the black bishop is just slicing down the board in literally every direction. That does give Magnus Carlsen a very significant advantage. All right, now we have rook f5 for Magnus, putting pressure on that pawn on h5. What is white going to do? Rook c8, trying to get rid of one pair of rooks. Now, rook takes is forced, then rook takes, the king must move, king h7, and now we have rook c5, putting pressure on the a pawn on a5. Now we have rook takes h5, king to f1. Of course, king f1 was necessary as black was threatening checkmate on h1, so Gukesh, nothing gets by this guy. King f1, defending against the checkmate threat, and now b6, defending the pawn on a5, and now Magnus is officially up one pawn in the endgame, plus he has the initiative. This is going to be so hard for Gukesh to defend. All right, now, rook c7, jumping back with the rook. Rook h1 hits the king, king e2, then rook b1, putting pressure on the weak pawn on b2. Now we have bishop c1, retreating the bishop, h5. Magnus now has this giant mass of pawns on the king side. His plan is simple. Just push that alpha 0 h-pawn down the board all the way to h1, and as black controls the queening square, it is going to be so incredibly difficult for white to stop it. All right, now, king e3 hits the bishop, bishop d5. The bishop is now perfectly defended. There's no good way to dislodge that bishop. It is a monster. It is cemented on that square forever. All right, now, king d3, h4, bishop g5, h3. Can anything stop this pawn? Well, Gukesh is going to try his one last crazy trick. Bishop f6. This was the idea, bishop g5. Now, of course, that pawn on g7 is pinned to the king on h7 by the rook on c7, meaning g takes f6 is not a legal move. You can't do it even if you try here. Now here, Magnus, he doesn't care. h2, the audacity, threatening to promote his alpha 0 h-pawn. Now, Gukesh, rook takes g7, winning the pawn, and now Magnus, all he has to do is find one last good move. And it turns out he only has two options, king to h8 and king to h6. Now, if you go king h8, then perhaps white can go, I don't know, rook takes g4, then rook h4, and try to defend. But instead here in the game, king h6 was played, not allowing rook takes g4 with the discovered attack by the bishop on the king. And therefore here, white has no good checks. I mean, bishop takes bishop g5, loses the rook, and rook to either h7 or rook to g6 loses the rook as well. Therefore, there's no way to stop h1 promoting to a queen, and for that reason here, Gukesh, he resigned on the spot to the GOAT, the greatest chess player of all time, Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game. All right, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button and check out this video right here, where I cover yet another one of Gukesh D's best games against the GOAT, Magnus Carlsen. If you want to see more Gukesh versus Magnus action, check that video out. And as always, I will see you in the next video.